Hi everyone, welcome back. Nathan here. Absurd Being, Kierkegaard number 3. We're at the third video. So today, I'm just going to go straight to the diagram and look at what we're covering today. So if you look at the left side there again, underneath opposites, we've covered those first two blocks. And today we're going to focus on that third block there, reflection, passion, thinking, existing, thinking, acting, and abstract, concrete. And so I've grouped them all together just because they're all kind of similar. They're similar in tone. The ideas behind them are all relatively similar. So let's get into it. The first one will be reflection and passion. Okay, so passion is I guess the distinction between the two here is pretty clear. Reflection is an act of thinking. It's contemplating, kind of analyzing with reason, as opposed to passion, which is this lived momentary exuberance or commitment, dedication, and they do definitely suggest they have a temporal distinction. Reflection happens afterwards and kind of outside of the moment, if you like. Passion, however, is in that moment. It's immediate, and it goes without saying that Kierkegaard values, well, it doesn't go without saying actually, but I'll tell you, that Kierkegaard values the will and passion more than thinking. And the quote I have for this is, "It is my conviction that the will is of primary importance even in connection with thinking, that talents 10 times as good without an energetic will do not constitute as good a thinker as talents 10 times as poor combined with an energetic will. The superb talents help to understand much. The energetic will helps to understand the one thing." So the will is important, and it's what injects some kind of passion into life. And life can't be lived without that passion. And if we just keep looking at in stages, the next point I wanted to make, and it's related to the point about temporality I mentioned earlier, reflection and the understanding these days. Kierkegaard's pseudonym, I forget who it is at the end of stages, but his pseudonym criticizes modernity for having lost immediacy. There's no longer any people aren't passionate in their lives anymore. It's become too, people have become too reflective, and the understanding has come to hold a more important role in everyday life. And so we're more reflective now than we used to be. And that is a criticism that he launches. At the time, he's talking about plays and poetry and things. So he's talking about the arts and how we can't appreciate now the kinds of art that were popular and that deserve appreciation, especially from the past, because we're too reflective, we're too governed by our understanding now. We look at something that plays out, say, on the screen, and we analyze it, we reflect on it, we intellectualize it, and so it's lost meaning for us now. And like I say, this is bad because the immediate is crucial in life. And everything Kierkegaard talks about, it comes back to living, to existing. to a real concrete existence in some way or other. And so without that immediate, without that passion that characterizes the immediacy of life, isn't lived at all. It's something we reflect on, we think about, rather than living. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. But just a couple of things to add about passion. It's essential. Passion is essential in becoming a subjective thinker. Kierkegaard calls this. So he says we can have aesthetic and ethical passion, and through that, the thinker gains concrete existence. So it's not enough to think. We have to have aesthetic and ethical passion in order to gain concrete existence. And that's an interesting point, because I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like it's a common misunderstanding of Kierkegaard that those three spheres, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, I think they might be misunderstood as like you move from one to the other, like a progression, and you finally get to the religious. It's not quite like that. There's more overlap. There's more. It's not you don't move out of the aesthetic into the ethical, and then away from the ethical into the religious. They're more like three concentric circles, with faith or religious being the biggest and encompassing the other two, which you will have seen on the diagram if you look. And so we'll talk about that in more detail, but that's just kind of a preview of where we're going with that. Passion is the highest point for inwardness. So whenever you have, and Kierkegaard's again all about inwardness, focusing inward on the individual, the subject, rather than other people or general abstractions. He's all about getting inward, and passion is the highest characteristic of inwardness. And it also goes along with the idea of truth as paradox, which we'll come to later, and faith, which is also tied in with that idea of paradox, because you can't have faith and you can't have truth as paradox if you don't have passion, because you won't get there through the intellect. You can't get there by reasoning your way, by reflecting your way through the understanding into a paradox by definition. And the paradox is crucial for Kierkegaard later when we come to look at faith. And therefore you need that passion to carry you through, because intellect's not going to do it. Understanding's not going to get you there. You have to have passion to believe in the paradox, to accept the paradox. Although I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there, but passion, that's how important passion is for Kierkegaard. So the second pair I want to look at, I'm actually going to combine two. We'll look at thinking and abstract versus existing and concrete. Right, so in science and in history, thinking is the highest. In the and in modern times as well, right? Thinking is valued above all else. The intellect, the understanding has really become the most important thing. It's the thing we value the most, and our educational systems all reflect this. All of the people that we listen to on podcasts and things like that, they're all intellectuals, and especially science, right? Science is, with the progress of science and the successes science has had, it's elevated this understanding and reasoning, and intellect to a level where it has a value that it's never had before at any other time in human history, I think. So anyway, the quote: "One does not love, one does not have faith, one does not act. but one knows what love, what faith are, and the only question is their place in the system. And so there Kierkegaard is criticizing this over-intellectualization, this reliance on the understanding. We don't engage anymore in our lives. We don't live our lives. We don't love. We don't have faith. But we know what they are. We can describe them. We can define them. The only thing we need to know is how they fit into the system of life that we've reasoned out. And obviously Kierkegaard is I mean, he's always criticizing Hegel here, but that it's almost certainly a reference to Hegel when Kierkegaard talks about the system. And so that's just that point we talked about before. It's we're not living our lives, we're understanding them rather than existing. So in subjectivity, thinking is not higher than existing. Abstract thinking, the abstract thinker ends up comical because in disregarding the concrete, the actual, the existing, they are on the point of ceasing to be a human being. Kierkegaard says that in Concluding Unscientific Postscript, which is the central point, I would say. If you're only going to take away one thing from Kierkegaard, it's that you have to exist, you have to live. Also in the postscript, Kierkegaard often praises the uneducated simpleton over the highly educated intellectual who's philosophizing away on how to combine all the elements of human existence and bring them all together into a system where nothing is left out and everything's governed by logic and reason and so on. And in the postscript, he just goes back and lifts the uneducated person up, who doesn't know, who doesn't understand all of this stuff, but is living his or her life, is actually engaged with existence rather than caught up thinking about it, over-analyzing, over-rationalizing everything. So actuality can't be expressed in abstraction, because abstraction can only grasp actuality by suspending it or knowing it. And knowing something like this precisely transforms it into possibility, as opposed to actuality, as opposed to the concrete. And so remember the last video we talked about the way that Kierkegaard kind of disparages possibility. It's something that he's always looking to get away from. And if he could, you get the sense that if he could, he would get rid of it. Because it's a source of anxiety and it's the source of, my computer just turned off. It's the source of anxiety and the thing that's important is existing, which comes with actuality rather than possibility. And so when we know something, when we're abstracting out from the actual, from the concrete, that's when we start to deal with the possible rather than the actual. We start to try and know it rather than just living it, engaging with it. Because when we know something, but through reflection, that's not the same, obviously, as living it, existing in it and with it. So let me give you a quote. What abstraction demands of him is that he become disinterested in order to have something to know. What the ethical demands of him is that he be infinitely interested in existing. And so that's just exactly what we're talking about, right? You have to abstraction requires you to step back so you can disengage from what's happening, life, existence, or the concrete. disengage from that, and then you can know it, because you're looking at it as a totality, as something complete, something you can then go to philosophical work on. You can start to understand it and piece things together, but you're not living it, obviously, if you're doing that. Whereas the ethical demands the opposite, that one be infinitely interested in existing. So that is the sole goal, existence, the concrete. And I'll just, at the risk of, I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, I've tried to separate these out, but anyway, existence cannot be thought. This is good. Existence cannot be thought, but I think. This means that I think intermittently, before and after I exist. So he's not saying that existence is unthinking. He's not saying we ought not to think, or that there can't be any thinking and existing. We ought to, as if the two could be separated. What he's saying is that human existence is a thinking existence. But we often place the emphasis on that thinking and ignore the second part of that, the existence. And what he wants to do is perhaps reverse that. So the focus is on existing, and we exist as a thinking subject, as a thinking existence. But he's clear that no system of life itself is possible. And that's just because, what I was saying before, you can't abstract your way out of life and then create a system out of it, create a system in which you've understood life in its totality, for the simple reason that you are that life, you are living that life. So it's not finished, it's not even, it's not complete. You can't step back from it and look at it as a whole and put all the pieces together, or see how all the pieces fit, because all the pieces aren't there yet. You're engaged in living. While you're abstracting out from life and trying to make a system out of it, you're actually living. So the life that you've abstracted from and you're making a system out of doesn't capture what's happening when you are trying to make that system, which is part of life. So he's really clear that you can't have a system of life. You can only live it. You can only exist. And I've got some more. I've said some more things. Yeah, I think they're all just saying the same thing in different ways. You can't think your way into a life by creating a system. To think a life is not to have lived one. That's another nice little idea. So a couple more things on this. Thinking, he talks about in, I think this is in the concept of anxiety. Thinking through logic is insufficient for actuality because it has no room for contingency. In logic, you get no contingency. It's everything is ordered and structured and necessary. There's no scope, there's no room for the contingent. But that's what life is. Life is based 100% on the contingent. Most things in a human life are contingent. They didn't have to be that way. It could have gone a different way. And so the logic that underpins thought and reflection and abstraction fails, is insufficient to explain, to cope with what life is, which is fundamentally contingent. So that's another interesting point, useful to know. So the next point is everything that I'm talking about today really does revolve around that central idea of existence versus abstract thought. So I think I am repeating myself a little bit, but I'm trying to get a few different points. So everything kind of revolves around that idea, but I hope that there are some I'm not just repeating myself 10 times. The next point is interesting, and he talks about actuality as movement. So it's a movement, specifically the movement of becoming, which we've looked at already, non-being to being, possibility to actuality. And so that's what actuality is. It's this movement of becoming from non-being to being. Now you get movement in logic, in thinking as well, but it's not genuine movement. It's not real movement because it's immanent, he says. No movement may come about, for logic is, and everything logical simply is. So what he's talking about there is, when he says immanent, he means that it's completely, whatever happens, the movement that happens is within the boundaries of logic. So it's all self-contained in the same structure, in the same format. There's no genuine other. There's no genuine movement outside of the bounds of the concepts and the abstractions that logic is dealing with. And if there's no genuine transcendence, that's the opposite of immanence. If there's no genuine transcendence outside of one's position, outside of the whole that one is in, then there can be no becoming. And that means there can be no actuality, because actuality is becoming. Rather, what we have, and we've already seen this with necessity, is that logic doesn't become. Logic just is. There's no movement there. There's no progression. Logic is just a fixed, immutable truth. It's just a fact. It's just the rules of logic, the things that the consequences of logic. There's no movement in there. There's no progression to them. They just are. They're just true according to the rules of logic. They're necessary. So without them movement of becoming, then there's no actuality. We're not dealing with actuality. We're not dealing with existence or the concrete. So logic is unable to deal with actuality. So I'll read what I have to flesh this out just a little bit more. Movement is a transcendence which requires the negative, non-being. And so actuality, movement, the movement of becoming, has to go outside itself. It has to go to the negative. That's where it gets the impetus for this movement, for its becoming. It doesn't just operate within itself. It looks to the negative, the non-being. And that's where becoming happens. That's where becoming takes place. So it's not immanent. It's not locked within itself. It's not self-contained. It goes outside of itself. It's transcendent. Logic, of course, admits the negative, but only as a contraposition in order to facilitate movement. And that contraposition is not truly negative. It's not a real non-being. It's just another position. It's just another postulate. The way, an example of this, my computer keeps going into battery saving mode. So I've lost my train of thought now. So in this, the negative is not really the negative, right? The negative that logic calls forth in order to get the movement isn't really negative. It's a positive. It's just another idea, another concept. That's what I was going to say. It's a way to think about this is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea. That's a logical structure which has some movement, right? You can see the movement. We're moving from the thesis to the antithesis, and then to the synthesis. So there's movement there, but it hasn't gone outside of itself. It hasn't. It's immanent. It's all within the realm of being. There's no genuine transcendence. So there's no genuine becoming here. That's Kierkegaard's position. There's no. It's a change, right? It's transformation. If you remember from the last video, it's transformation. It's not the movement of becoming, which requires that genuine negative, genuine non-being. And you don't get that in logic. Logic can't deal with non-being because it's nothing, it says. It's just, there is only being. Although Hegel does talk about, so when Hegel talks about it, he talks about I haven't read Hegel, so I'm not an expert on him, but I think there's more to this story than perhaps Kierkegaard's telling us. Anyway, Hegel uses the words abstract, negative, and concrete. And he demonstrates this with being, actually, being, non-being, and becoming, which seems to parallel what Kierkegaard's talking about. But Kierkegaard says it's different because Hegel hasn't actually gone outside of being. He brings forth a negative in order to generate the movement, which gives us becoming. But the negative is not a genuine negative in the way that Kierkegaard frames it, as non-being. So he's critical of that. Like I say, I haven't read Hegel, so I can't judge whether that criticism is warranted or not. But anyway, the idea there is that logic is unable to generate true movement, the movement of becoming, which means it's unable to cope with actuality, which requires that movement. All right, and the last section today is thinking versus action. Okay, so this is interesting. Kierkegaard has an interesting definition of action and an interesting way of thinking about it that kind of opposes it with thinking. And again, it's hard to see that Sartre did not get his ideas, or at least some of them, from Kierkegaard, because Sartre is all about action as well. Everything is the action is the only thing that's important for him, and he says that in Being and Nothingness, and we're gonna look at that right here, right now. So action is not thought, or else my thought would already be action before I acted. So he rules that out first. But nor is action the external, the external act. And he talks about there, the person who owns not a penny can be as charitable as the one who gives away a kingdom. So we can't define act by the external, by what someone does, because there's more to it than that. Someone who's broke can be just as charitable by giving away, relatively to the person, relative to someone who's rich. They can be more charitable than that person by giving away less. So we can't judge an action. So an action is not thought, but nor is it external. What is it? This is Kierkegaard's definition. An internality in which the individual cancels the possibility and identifies himself with what is thought in order to exist in it. All right, so let's look at this one in a bit of detail. Action is an internality in which the individual cancels the possibility. So that's the first thing. The action must cancel possibility. It can't keep it alive, right? So the action gets rid of possibility. It doesn't allow for the possible to come back once the action is made, once the resolution has been committed to. Then the possibility's gone. It can't be revisited. You can't call it back and say, maybe I'll do the other thing. There's no that option's not there anymore. So a genuine action happens internally, and the first thing is it cancels the possibility. The alternative is no longer an option. Next, he identifies himself with what is thought. So you have to internalize it in a way, internalize that action. It has to resonate with you and who you are. And finally, in order to exist in the action or in the thought. And so this is crucial. You identify yourself with it, so you embody it, you allow it to resonate within you, so that you can exist in it, so that it has concrete, actual value, not just not concrete actual value, I guess. So those are the three things, or that's the quote, which I think, in which Kierkegaard defines action and internality, in which you cancel the possibility. So one thing I did say is it's important that if your relation to the possibility can be changed at any time, then you haven't acted yet, according to Kierkegaard. So that's an important thing that is often missing, right? When we think about action, we talk about acting, but we're acting, but we're not cancelling other options. Other options are still there. They're always. We seldom act in such a way, in such a decisive manner, that we rule out other options, we rule out other possibilities, and truly embody or embrace that decision that we've made, that act that we've committed, even if it's only internal. I mean, and that's where it has to start. It has to be internal. It's a commitment. So action it's kind of a resolution. It's a commitment. It's not just doing stuff, or it's not just deciding you'll do stuff. It's actually it's a real commitment here. And so on the idea of the possibility, your relation to the possibility, Kierkegaard says this: altogether, what marks the difference between the thought action and in the inner sense, actual action, is the fact that while every further reflection and consideration respecting the former must be regarded as welcome, in respect of the latter, it is to be looked at as a temptation. So this is interesting. What marks the difference between the thought action and the actual action? If you think about it some more, if you consider and reflect on it again, then it's then that's a welcome activity. You know, you decide to do something, and then later you're thinking about it again, or something else happens and it makes you reconsider what you've done. Then that's fine. If we're talking about this thought action. But if we're talking about an actual action, the Kierkegaardian action, then any additional doubt or reflection, if something happens and it perhaps it indicates that your decision or your initial action was was wrong, then that is no longer something that you ought to, it's no longer something we ought to be doing. It should be considered a temptation, something that's trying to pull us off track. So a genuine action for Kierkegaard is only something that gets rid of that possibility, and no matter what happens afterwards, any additional thoughts, any additional doubts or uncertainties, or any future situations, circumstances that arise that cause you to reflect on this decision or this action, they are a temptation. They're trying to tempt you away from your decision, and you're to regard them as that, as a temptation, not as more information that you didn't have before. Useful. Perhaps I can remake my decision. Perhaps I can redecide or act in a different way now. Change my actions. Genuine action doesn't admit of that, doesn't go down that road. So the two consequences of this I have noted. People often don't act in this sense of the word. So genuine action is rare. It's seldom seen. Very often do we act in this kind of decisive, resolute fashion, right? And the other consequence is that outward indications reveal nothing of true action. So whatever you do on the outside, that's not indicative of true action, which happens inside. In a way, Kierkegaard's really he's defining action as like a commitment, a resolution to do something, and it should not actually have any external manifestation. If it does, then you've probably made the decision for the wrong reason. If it's a genuine action, you've made it internally for yourself, you've committed to it, and other people won't even know. And that's also an important theme in Kierkegaard, which we'll look at in much more detail. The very last thing I have here is something from Either Or. Thought being the consequence of logical chains of reasoning reaches its conclusions by necessity. Action stems from a choice and is therefore governed by freedom. So something we've talked about before, but good to just bring it into this context, I think. Thought operates with logic and reason, and so therefore it's governed by necessity. This thought will necessitate this thought logically, reasonably, according to reason. Action, however, stems from a choice, a decision, that commitment. And because of that, it's governed by freedom, not necessity. Okay, so that's where I'm going to finish today. And I'll just quickly run through a summary of what we have looked at in this video. So we have there first, we talked about reflection and passion. And we saw that Kierkegaard values the will and passion over reflection. He values that immediacy that comes with passion, that lets you engage rather than this disinterested, reflective understanding. And passion is also essential for inwardness and faith. Faith has that paradox. You have to have passion in order to have faith. Then we looked at the thinking and the abstract versus the existing and the concrete. And in subjectivity, existing we saw is higher than thinking. So this was the opposite of thought and abstraction, where, well, thought is obviously, in thought, thinking is obviously higher than existing. But it was in history, science, philosophy, those kinds of disciplines, thinking is higher than existing. So Kierkegaard's reversing that. And existence cannot be thought, it can only be lived. So there's no system of life. You can't have a system of life just because you're still living it. And the last section there was thinking versus action, where I stressed that action must cancel possibility, and it exists internally in the thought. That's where action happens. There's not an external. There ought not to be an external manifestation. It's just internal, but it's a commitment. It's choice. And finally, thought moves by necessity through logic and reason, whereas action is governed by freedom. And that's where we are at the end of this video. I'll just bring up the diagram and just cover the rest of those opposites briefly, just talk about them briefly, because I'm not going to dedicate a whole video. I mean, I will dedicate a video to them, but it'll be in other areas. I'll move to other areas of that diagram. So the diagram, if you look underneath opposites, underneath the four that we covered today, there are only three left: subjective versus objective, inwardness versus externality. And we've talked about those already, we've touched on them, but I've separated them out just because I think it's important. It's good to note that they're different as opposites, and we're going to cover those in much more detail when we look at mainly the postscript, concluding unscientific postscript. He talks about them a lot. And the last opposite there is the relative versus the absolute, and just basically the relative is something which is for the sake of something else. It has value for the sake of something else, not in and of itself, as opposed to the absolute, which is for the sake of itself, and basically that is eternal happiness. And we'll look at that a little bit later when we come to the three spheres of existence. Otherwise, that's where I'm going to sign off here. Hopefully that's helped a little bit, and I'll catch you for the next video 4, right? So thanks for listening, and see you shortly.